Afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to just give everyone a few minutes to log in, and then we'll get started with today's programming. We're excited for another day of virtual FDS. We've got about a third of you here so far, so we'll wait a little bit longer. Sure, some of you are coming to us from work today rather than from home, so hopefully you're fully dressed today, not just from the top up. All right. The UMEC members are stepping in. That's good to see. All right. We got about 100 of you here so far, so we're going to get started this afternoon. So good afternoon and welcome back for day 2 of APGO 2022 FDS, All Systems Go. We hope you enjoyed the programming yesterday and had a chance to connect with friends and colleagues through the virtual meeting platform.
We have quite a competition going on. Please be sure to check the Win a Prize section on the left-hand column of the Whova app and get engaged. If you compete in the tasks that are listed there, the winner will receive a prize, which is yet to be determined, but it will be fabulous.
And as we go through our presentations today, just as a reminder to everybody, due to the virtual nature of this meeting, we've shortened the bios so that the verbal intros will be only current position and institution. But we really do encourage you to read the full presenter bios and the meeting platform so that you can get a full sense of each speaker's tremendous experience and expertise.
So now it's my honor to present the William M.P. Herbert, M.D. Promising Educator Award. But first, let's go to the satellite feed, Chris.
Coming right up, Elise. Here we go.
When I received the APGO Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008, it came with a $10,000 grant to support any educational mission in APGO that I wanted to initiate or support. It's been known for decades that recognition for research and scholarly presentations and journal writings has trumped educational achievement and endeavors. The fact that this has been the case has been sad. Most all research findings are replaced over time, including my own in MFM, yet the effects of education are timeless. Who doesn't remember being taught by good teachers from even our earliest days in our academic career? Therefore, I decided that I wanted to direct this grant fund towards recognizing high achievers in women's healthcare education. Ultimately, I chose to establish an annual award to a promising young medical educator in our field. In doing so, such distinction would hopefully provide her or him with tangible documentation of their educational expertise, and in doing so, shorten the time to promotion and tenure, as well as increase educational opportunities for scholarly presentations, both at APGO and other venues. Thus, the Promising Young Educator Award was founded with apparent success over the ensuing years. As the funding from the initial grant dwindled over the years, my family provided additional funding to keep this annual award active. Also, over the past 10 years, the amount of the award has doubled. Several years ago, my family and I concluded that the establishment of a permanent endowment sufficient to continue this annual award perpetually was in order. Working closely with APGO, we are in the final stages of funding this endowment. I very much appreciate all the contributions that APGO has made to my own career, professionally and personally, and I'm grateful that my family endorsed the concept of this endowment. I would like to thank everyone at APGO for the opportunity to recognize a promising medical educator with this award every year since 2009. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to the podium to announce this year's Promising Educator Award recipient.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Herbert. The winner of the 2002 Herbert Award is Dr. Shannon DeGroff from the University of Connecticut. Congratulations, Dr. DeGroff. So please say hello and congratulations to Dr. DeGroff in the chat as well as through the Whova app. Now we're moving on to our plenary sessions. Our first plenary speaker of the day is Dr. Noor Osman. Dr. Osman is a primary care physician in the Division of General Medicine and the Director of Student Medical Education in the Department of Medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Osman, who will present Don't Move the Goalpost, Achieving Equity in Medical Education. Take it away, Dr. Osman.
Thank you, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Can people hear me? Just a thumbs up or something if you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now. And you'll let me know if there's trouble with seeing the screen. It's really exciting and an honor for me to be here today with all of you. Some of you are friends and mentors of mine and teachers. I'm incredibly humbled by this opportunity to talk to you. I'll say up front, I went to medical school to become an OB-GYN. So I've always felt a deep connection to this community from afar. It's absolutely true. And I have a tiny bit of jealousy whenever I see packs of OB-GYNs walking down the hallway. I always think, oh, can I go with you too? So I'm hoping that we can have a conversation today. I left a lot of time at the end for us to have a chat, to the extent that webinars allow us to. I have one disclosure, which is that part of my salary is paid for by a grant from USAID. And I'm supposed to say that their views in this talk do not necessarily reflect the views of the American people or of the US government. Some of the photographs I use in this talk are mine and some just come from the internet, and I always feel like I should say that too. So John Dalrymple and a couple of others asked me to speak today about equity and assessment, and I actually named the talk before I had written the talk. And so I was a little worried that the title wasn't going to make sense, and then I thought about it some more and thought there is something in this idea about not moving the goalposts. There's something about fairness in the way we assess, and indeed fairness in the learning environment as a whole, that I wanted to think about with you today. We're going to start with some background. This is our roadmap for today. We'll start with some background, and then we'll move on to the specific context of the learning environment. And then we'll get into some specifics about assessment. And as I said, I've left a lot of time at the end, I hope, for us to talk to the extent that webinars allow. I also want to take a minute now before I begin the talk to say something specific. I'm asked to talk about educational disparities and equity a lot. And when I do, my talks typically focus on racial bias and inequity. And I want to be very clear right now with all of you that I know that these are not the only biases that affect our learners and our faculty and our community. They're very real phenomena of othering that affect everyone in our community, all of our community members who come from non-majority groups. So I want to say clearly at the outset that while I may be using examples that speak explicitly about race, I'm not speaking exclusively about race and racism. So we'll begin with talking about the background. Then in the middle, we'll talk about assessment. And then in the end, we'll have a conversation about where we're going to go. I think we've all started to take for granted the pillars of academic medical education. We tend to think about patient care and research and education as the three primary pillars that keep our academic institutions up, right? They're the ones that keep us standing. And I'm probably not alone in this group of educators and feeling sometimes that our institutions attend to the pillars of patient care and of research more assiduously than they do to the pillar of education. And I think that all of us as educators probably have felt at one point or another that the energy and effort needed for the robust examination of our pedagogical practices and our pedagogical sort of educational philosophy just aren't supported the same way that our patient care and research agendas are. And this worries me a little bit. I think for our institutions to stay standing, we have to pay attention to all three pillars the same way, right? With the same attention. Otherwise, our institutions will fall. Because the truth is, even if you don't buy the pillars holding up the structure metaphor, medicine is part of an ecosystem, and we have to attend to each element carefully if we're going to keep it in balance. It affects our learners, it affects our faculty, it affects our patients, it affects our communities, and we say this all the time, right? We change the way we deliver care, for example, but we don't change the way we teach. Or we change the content of what we teach, but then we don't also change the way we assess our learners, right? We hold on to one part while adjusting another part, and we don't see or acknowledge the ripple effects. So I think a lot about this question. As we strive to practice evidence-based, mission-driven medicine, do we apply the same principles to the continuum of medical education? I don't know. Are we practicing evidence-based, mission-driven education? And said more specifically to the context of this talk, are we attending to and reflecting within our walls, the walls of our institutions, the evolution and revolution around equity and justice that we're seeing outside, right? Because there's a lot going on outside, a lot. The world has literally felt like it was on fire these days. It's burning up. There's chaos and there's fear and there's trauma and there's inequity. And at the same time, we are starting to have conversations around these questions, conversations around trauma and inequity and equity and bias and injustice in ways that we haven't been able to have conversations about this probably in a generation. And we tend to focus these conversations around things like prison reform and the spheres of housing and police violence and immigration policy and sexual and gender health and reproductive health. But we also recognize, I think, those of us who think about this kind of stuff, that the conversations that we're having about the injustices, policy injustice and individual injustice that are happening outside our walls are very similar to and bring light to the injustices within our walls. In fact, there are true parallels between what's happening outside and the conversations that we need to be having inside. It's hard because I'm talking to a screen and I'm not talking to all of you, but I'm guessing that there are people in the audience who know what I'm talking about and who have recognized or have felt similar things. So today, I thought we would start to think about equity in the learning environment using Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model. And for those of you who have masters in public health, I know a lot of you know this model. We're starting to think about it more in the realm of medical education. This is a theory-based framework which describes how individual, interpersonal, institutional, and societal factors affect behavior and can affect education and policy. My colleagues and I have used this framework to describe how we might think about achieving equity in the medicine clerkship, for example. We have a paper on that. And I should say now, I'm happy to share all references with you all at the end, or I can send them in and people can look up the things that I'm referring to. So we talked about this and used this model to think about equity in the internal medicine clerkship. And we published on that in our green journal. And then we also wrote about this in terms of growth mindset and in the learning environment. The first layers of this model are the individual and the interpersonal levels. And that's where I like to start to think about the idea of bias. This slide is just a reminder of how our minds, oh no, my slides just went away. Hang on. What do people see on the screen? Because my computer just turned itself off.
We just see you right now.
All you see is me.
Yes.
Hi. Hang on. Let's see if I can share again. It just sent one of these like error. Okay. So let's see.
You have to totally close it out and reopen it. and share.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do right now.
Okay.
What can you see now?
We see the slide with the weird floor.
The slide with the weird floor, exactly. So I was saying that this slide is a reminder that our minds can play tricks on us. Our brains are wired to categorize and identify patterns. And so implicit bias, what we call implicit bias, some people call it implicit bias, some people call it unconscious bias, some people just call it bias. I don't think there's a right thing to call it. Bias refers to this patterned thinking that we have that unconsciously shapes our responses and our understanding and our attitudes. And it refers to the unconscious quick responses and judgments that are triggered by physical characteristics, like skin color or facial features, by accent, by other things that you can see quickly and make judgments about. And biases begin at an early age, and they're reinforced over a lifetime in response to explicit and implicit social messages, to life experiences, to the media, to values and opinions expressed by our parents or teachers, the doctors we work with. Biases can be positive and they can be negative. And we tend to have implicit biases that favor our own group, but not always. Members of disempowered groups sometimes internalize messages from the more powerful groups, and they harbor unfavored biases towards themselves. So optical illusions demonstrate how our minds can be tricked and how biases work and how our responses are often just triggered. This floor is painted this way. This floor is not curvy. This floor is painted this way, specifically so that children don't run in the hallway. So when the children don't run in the hallway, they are responding to perception and not reality. So Diana Burgess is a social scientist, a psychologist at the VA system in Minnesota, and she and her group have studied and written a lot about bias in the clinical spaces and how we can learn to mitigate the effects of bias in our work and in our learning environments. And she describes this as a two-phase phenomenon. The first phase is activation, and this is when biases are triggered in the presence of someone who belongs to a certain social group. I'll give you an example. I'm from New York City, and I know that there are people who hear deep New York accents and make immediate bad associations with them, not me. There's nothing about the New York City accents that feel bad to me. I have the opposite reaction, I really do. I do, however, have some associations with other accents, and I'm sure all of us have associations with certain kinds of accents. So that's activation. The second phase is application, and this is when an individual's biases are then applied in the form of behavior towards the person or groups in question. And so why does this matter? Well, it matters because there are certain things that we can do that there are certain things in our lives that are more likely to lead us to apply our biases. And unfortunately, many of these factors are things we know well in work. Compassion fatigue, from emotional exhaustion, from multitasking, from cognitive load, socialization, the lack of diversity in the places that we work, and the list goes on and on and on. I'm sure if you took a second right now and thought, what are the days when I am the most easily triggered into behaving badly? There are all these factors that have to do with, unfortunately, with the work environment for us. But the good news is that this framework does allow us to find space to prevent activation from becoming application when we're aware of our history, when we can name our biases, if there's mindfulness practice. So going back to my example, when I hear the accents that can be a little triggering to me, I know that taking a step back and naming that to myself, not to the person who's talking, but to myself, can be helpful in the moment. So thinking about this in terms of the social ecological model that I gave you all before, it might make sense for us to think of this framework as working only in the level of the individual and the interpersonal relationships. But I would argue that it's really important for us to remember that the individual work that we do can only go so far. In fact, we're at our best when we're in institutions that support this too, through standardized practices that mitigate bias. And that's what we'll get to soon. So, all right, so we talked about a framework for understanding bias. And now we're going to talk about understanding the context of our specific learning environment and specific applications to assessment. if we were all together, I think you would all know exactly who this is a picture of. I always like to start with a brief review of the historical context, specifically of racism in medical education and medical care. There have been really great strides in medicine over the past years, but there's also a dark side of discrimination and trauma at the core of our medical history. And you all know who this person on the right of the picture on the left is. This is J. Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology. And do you know that some people, I don't know why I'm asking because nobody can answer me, but do you know that some people actually refer to him as the architect of the vagina, which seems problematic. Maybe I'll use that word. It seems problematic. So he, as you know, is one of the most well-known examples of surgical experimentation. He famously developed the repair of vesicovaginal fistulas through repeated operations on slave women without anesthesia. And then on the right of the screen is Abraham Flexner, whose seminal report analyzing the failings of medical education led to sweeping reform that changed how and where we educate our students. Everything we do right now is based on his 1910 blueprint for medical education. So we owe a lot to him. But this blueprint was disastrous for the historically Black medical colleges founded in the late 19th century because it changed not only how and where we train, but also who we train. And so one less known, or maybe it's becoming more known, but certainly less discussed consequence of the report is that it led to the closing of all but 2 medical schools that were opened, that were started specifically to train Black adult, usually Black adult males, actually Black men. This was before women were really going to medical school. So there was Howard in the South and Meharry in the South and Howard in the North. And this excluded Black men and then later Black women from practicing medicine, excluded them from getting medical degrees unless they went to those specific schools. It concentrated knowledge, money, and power with white, typically men, male doctors. And it excluded enormous communities in our country from receiving equitable and culturally concordant care. And there were real consequences to this institutional change. There were structural disadvantages that concentrated money and power, as I said, but also it left Black Americans in this country vulnerable and mistrusting, and obviously subject to events like the untreated syphilis trial, which is the photograph on the right. And that, I think it's inarguably one of the darkest episodes in our history of American public health. And we know that these structural factors continue to lead to health disparities that affect communities of color at alarming rates. And while a lot of the disparities in healthcare reflect structural inequalities leading to economic disadvantage and limited access to care, there's something else going on there, right? There's something else going on when in VA studies at the Veteran Administration hospitals, patients of color are less likely to be referred for total knee arthroplasty. And it's not necessarily structural problems when women of color with fracture are less likely to receive osteoporosis evaluation and treatment, right? And the list of these inequities that are not necessarily based in structural or economic disadvantage, when the list goes on and on and on and on, which it does. And I'm sure in OB-GYN, there are countless examples of these kinds of unequal treatment and also unequal results and outcomes. So with this history in mind, there's now a broad recognition. Everyone believes in the importance of educating a diverse workforce to serve our diverse population. We know that diversity has countless benefits. That patients who are cared for by racially and linguistically concordant providers have better outcomes. That students who train in a diverse environment, no matter what their race is, are more equipped to care for racially diverse patients in their future careers. And that diverse teams across sectors, so not just in medicine, but in law and in business, outperform teams that are not diverse. So diversity is a worthy goal. It's also codified. The LCME as of 2009 and the ACGME as of 2018 have official policies mandating that institutions develop specific strategies to achieve diversity. And what's interesting is 2009, so every 9 years, med schools have to have their LCME review. And so every medical school has had an opportunity to be reviewed. And I don't know what the outcomes have been in the most recent iteration, but I think it would be really, really interesting to look to see what's going on with the LCME and the ACGME levels. And, if we look back over the past 20 years, we have definitely seen some data that are encouraging. This is a 2018 paper in JAMA by Boatwright and others that show that the percentage of Black and Latino matriculants to medical schools is increasing, you see an upward inflection for the Black matriculants that maybe coincides with the LCME mandate. Despite these signals, though, despite the little bit of good news, the next few slides are going to show that we actually have a long way to go. So we know that racial and ethnic minorities comprise 40% of the US population, 13% Black and about 18% Latino. And the problem is that since 2015, we're not seeing numbers that reflect those population numbers at all. So 6% in 2015 graduates, 6% of the students graduating from medical school were Black and 5% were Hispanic or Latino. And I want to just draw attention to this specific kind of alarming statistic, which is that fewer Black men enter US medical schools today than in 1978. So I'm just going to say that again, there are fewer Black men entering medical school today than in 1978. If you look at the numbers, there are fewer Black men applying and fewer Black men graduating from medical school. And these are all data that are widely available. It goes without saying, obviously, that the total number of matriculants has gone up by about 44,000. And just to look at this problem differently, this is a really nice article too by Lynn and others describing what they call the representation quotient. And the representation quotient describes the ratio of the proportion of an ethnic group or racial group in the medical student body compared to the general age-matched US population. So RQ over 1 is overrepresentation, RQ under 1 is underrepresentation. And if you look at these graphs, if you look at the representation quotient of different racial and ethnic groups among the US medical students by state, you'll see bright teal or lime green, depending on which map you're in, shows an RQ of 1. Meaning that the ethnic group is represented equally when compared to the general population, and colors that are more blue, that get darker, are underrepresented, and yellow means that the group is overrepresented compared to the student body. So I just want to call your attention to this over here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but to the dark blue of the Black students in the South and Hispanic students in the Southwest, in Texas, and in California. The other thing that's really interesting is the paucity of data on American Indian and Alaskan Native students, because whenever there's an absence of data, it's something that catches my attention, because I always think, is this because we're not asking the question, or do we really truly just not have enough data? And all of this is just to say that diversity, while a very important goal, is a problem if it's our only goal. I sort of say we can't put all of our eggs in the diversity basket. And part of that, the first reason for that is, and this is, I think, the most obvious reason, is that diversity efforts have limited effectiveness, right? They can't work all the time. We can try and try and try, but they just don't work all the time. And I think the second important reason is that despite diversity efforts and despite whatever gains or strides we've made, there still are very real educational disparities that exist in our current learning environment. Again, just a quick reminder of what I said at the beginning, that I know I'm speaking explicitly about race and racism, but I'm not speaking exclusively about it. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit right now, just to talk a little bit about the learning environment and to talk about some phenomena that affect our students who come from underrepresented groups, from all kinds of non-majority groups. And a lot of these concepts are things you know about, and I'd love if you have comments or examples of things. It'd be great if you put these in the chat. The first thing I want to talk about is stereotype threat. Stereotype threat occurs when people are concerned about confirming a negative stereotype about their social group. And this often leads people to underperform within the threatened domain. It gives people a sense of uncertainty about their abilities, avoidance of certain things, and vigilance for signs of failure. Remember, I'm from New York City, so believe it or not, I sometimes don't talk at meetings, or I don't express my opinion, because I'm afraid people are just going to say she's just a loud New Yorker, and that they're not going to hear what I'm saying, because they're going to sort of see that I'm just kind of confirming their idea about New Yorkers in general. I think any of us who did residency can relate to this, which I'll let you read. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is the minority text. So we talked about stereotype threat, and now the minority text. And this is a portrait of Dr. Hinton, who's a microbiologist, and his portrait was just installed a few years ago. And his name is now being used as the name for one of our 4 Harvard societies. I think there are 4, there might be 5, but I think there are 4. I took this picture because I think it's fascinating to look at the difference between the way he's represented in his portrait and the guys on the right are represented in their portraits. If you look at his portrait, you see that he's surrounded by other people working, other people supporting, people looking at him. Whereas these guys on the right are all represented by themselves. It looks like their portraits are saying, I did everything by myself. I didn't need anybody and I didn't teach anybody. Whereas he seems like he's part of a community. And I think that this portrait, I don't know if they meant to do this, but for me, this portrait reflects the disparities in responsibility and opportunity that are incurred by membership in an underrepresented group. We often talk about the minority tax when we recognize that underrepresented faculty and learners are tasked with diversity efforts and equity efforts without dedicated time and resources or compensation. But there are 3 other dimensions to the minority tax that are really beautifully described in this perspective piece by Campbell and Rodriguez in Academic Medicine. The first is gratitude tax. Gratitude tax describes this idea that people are so grateful for the place they have in the institution they have, for the work they have, for the job that they were given, that they wouldn't even consider options other places. They won't consider jobs anywhere else. The second idea is this isolation tax, and isolation tax is this feeling, it's in the name, of being alone, right? Being alone in a place where there aren't a lot of people like you, which puts some cognitive burden and just feelings of loneliness on the person who's feeling this isolation tax. And then the third is mentorship tax. And mentorship tax describes this idea of being sort of rudderless without a mentor, having an idea of what you want to do, but being in a place where there's aren't a lot of people who share your values, your goals, your career ideas, your ways of thinking about things. And so you're left alone without a mentor. So we talked about the stereotype threat, we talked about mentorship tax, and then the third thing I wanted to mention to all of you is this idea of the conscripted curriculum. The conscripted curriculum comes from this paper by Laura Olson, and it describes the phenomenon of when students are asked to teach specifically about race, but you can imagine it about anything, using their own experience as their lesson plans. I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience can relate to this, either as somebody who's been asked to teach, or somebody who has unwittingly been the one to ask somebody to teach. I am sure I have made this mistake in my life of asking somebody to tell us about his or her experience. And the conscripted curriculum is an important thing for us to know and to think about for a variety of reasons. The first is it's a burden on the students from the underrepresented groups, like a social burden and also a cognitive burden. The second thing is that it creates this heterogeneity in teaching with uneven socialization. You can imagine if you're in a classroom with only one woman, for example, if that woman now is teaching everybody about the menstrual cycle, but in this other classroom, there are 5 women and they're all being asked, it's just not the same, it's not okay. And then the last thing is, it's a clear message from the schools that whatever the topic is, the students are being conscripted to teach about, in this case, race, is just not important. It's not important enough to be a standardized part of the curriculum. So how does this lead us to think about the specific domain of assessment? You're thinking like, oh my God, is she ever going to talk about assessment? Well, now we're going to talk about assessment. And why does any of this matter? Because we know that there are very real consequences when there are inequities in grading and assessment. This is a very nice paper also that you all can read from Ariane Tehrani and others at UCSF. And it describes something called the amplification cascade, which is a concept that describes how tiny differences in assessment can snowball. So tiny differences, in this case, in the assessment, tiny differences between the assessment of underrepresented students and non-UIM students. These tiny differences snowball, so that little differences in their clinical assessments then lead to differences in their clinical grades, which then leads to differences in honors, which then leads to differences in future opportunities like residency and fellowship placement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, when they looked at it, they saw that 1/10 of a point lower in scores by the clerkship director led to half as many honors in the core clerkships. That's 1/10 of a difference in the clerkship director's rating led to half as many honors. And we know that this is true. We know that Black students are less likely to be inducted into AOA Medical Honor Society than non-Black students, even when you control for grades, for USMLE scores, for publications, and for other available metrics. It's so true with AOA that a lot of schools are actually getting rid of AOA, and Mount Sinai very famously recently got rid of AOA. They studied it, and said, we can't make AOA better. We're getting rid of AOA. What's interesting is that Black students are not more or less likely to be inducted into the Gold Humanism Honor Society. We also know that UIM and non-UIM minority students are less likely than white students to receive honors grades in their medical clerkships. And this effect persists even when it's adjusted for shelf scores as a proxy for medical knowledge. So going back to the amplification cascade, the factors that go into it, things like honors, shelf scores, honors grades, all of those things are very, very real. So what can we do about assessment? What can we do about assessment? I thought we could end this talk together just by thinking about this. I keep saying together, even though I feel very far away from you all, but still, we're gonna do this together. We're gonna think about the specific domains of assessment. And I want to say we got rid of grades at our school a few years ago, and the jury is still out. John Dalrymple, I'm speaking to you. The jury is still out on this, but I know that this is something that's happening in a lot of schools. So I think it's interesting just to kind of think about assessment and grading, whether they're the same thing. So we're going to think about how we assess our students. What are the things we can do to achieve equity, and how we assess our students, how we write our assessments of our students, and how we grade. All right, so the first is how we assess our students. I think one of the most important things to consider when we think about how we assess our students is whether we do it enough, right? In our institution, our OB-GYN group, and I can't see you all there, but headed by Nikki Johnson, hi guys, is amazing at thinking about this, about standardizing it, about codifying it, about equipping their faculty to do it. I mean, that's really the important, I think, part of the important part that we forget about is the faculty development around this. And also making it known to their students that this is going to happen. So the recommendations that I would make here all sort of fall under this early and often philosophy. Do work-based assessments regularly. Like there's no such thing as too many assessments, right? Do them regularly. Use criterion referenced and competency-based assessments and checklists whenever you can, and then use well-defined rubrics and teach your faculty to do them so there's consistency. And this can be EPAs, it can be using the RHIME framework, it can be using mini CEX, it can be using something that you develop at your own institution. The truth is there's no right answer here, and I apologize if anybody's on the EPA's writing committee, but there's no right answer here. But doing this regularly with structural support potentially reduces the subjectivity in assessment, which, as we know, can introduce bias from a single observer or tool. So these are just two examples, and they're tiny on the screen, so I apologize for that. But on the left of the screen is the observed patient encounter. And these are both examples from friends of ours in Chicago, at University of Chicago and Northwestern. We know that checklists have been demonstrated to reduce clinical errors, and they can also be used for task-based assessment. So this observed patient encounter on the left is a really nice example of that. It's basically a checklist, right? And what I love about this is that they they attach it to, they correlate it with specific EPAs. And then on the right is another example, which is a note writing assessment pilot. And the faculty and the residents and their other supervisors are all trained on how to apply these. And what's nice about this one is I'm a big rhyme fan. Is they correlate this with rhyme. Rhyme is great. A few years ago, I was saying to everybody at Harvard, and particularly at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is my hospital, that I just wanted us to blanket the institution with rhyme. Rhyme all the time is what I was saying to people. It's silly, but I just felt like if we all could just use the same language, be trained in it, and have our students be trained in it, I really believed that it would help us. So we talked about how often to assess. Another way of thinking about how to assess is to think about what we assess, right? What are the domains that we assess? I think another way to mitigate bias and to level the playing field is specifically to vary and diversify the domains that we assess. So where do I get this recommendation? My colleague, Cindy Lai at UCSF, in her clerkship, the internal medicine clerkship, realized that they had a problem with equity. So what they did was they created a task force and they reached out to students and learned that the students felt that that the faculty and clerkship leadership were under recognizing students' contributions to patient advocacy. So students were doing a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes, and their actions just weren't being captured in the existing assessment system. So one of the themes that came up was that bilingual students felt this dual responsibility to not only be a student learner, but they also needed to be the team's translator. And I'm sure all of you have this experience, which is a great opportunity to advocate, right? But it also means less time for the student to study for exams and prepare for oral presentations and prepare for oral exams and do the other work of being a student. That work that was actually specifically being evaluated, right? And then another theme was that the students felt a great personal responsibility to ensure equitable care. And they spent considerable mental energy when they saw vulnerable patients being treated poorly. This came up for us, especially during COVID, where we had students coming and staying late and coming in during all kinds of off hours to make sure that patients were getting the care that they needed. All right, so what did they do? Well, they created a patient advocacy domain, and this was on the evaluation forms for all the supervisors, and it contributed to the grade. And it was vetted by a diverse set of stakeholders, and it was a 1 to 4 on the scale, with 1 being the student who doesn't identify the social cultural factors at all, and then 4 being the student who identifies social cultural factors. And they really, really wrote it out, and it's now considered part of their standard approach to teaching and assessment. Okay, so those were some examples of how we can change the way we assess. We can assess more often, and then we can think about assessing in other domains. And now I just want to talk briefly about how we write up our assessments. This is not going to come to a surprise. It comes as a surprise to any of you in the audience, but it turns out there's a huge difference in the way people are talked about, the way women are talked about compared to men. And I have a dog next to me who's now starting to growl. I apologize. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so there's a very big difference in the way men are talked about and women are talked about, and the way students of color are talked about and majority students are talked about. We can have an entire conversation about this, but we're not going to. But I will say that there's a lot of literature on this, and we actually wrote a paper. We've written a few papers about this actually that show that in fact these social gender normative expectations that we write about, women being nice and sharers and really good communicators, that actually female applicants, women applicants will start to internalize some of these gender normative patterns and then use that same kind of language when they describe themselves. And so the question is, can we be attentive to that, attentive to the language as it's coming in, as we're reading the assessments from our faculty, and then also as we're writing the assessments? Can we be attentive to that, seeing it, and then changing it? And we've tried this at our institution, and let me tell you, it's not easy. So these are some examples, please read these. These are actual examples that we've gotten over the years from our faculty, and then how we tried to adjust them. And then this is another. So we wanted to change, as is common in his culture, he was quiet and studious. We want to change that to behaviorally based language. So in the internal medicine world, we started paying a lot of attention to this, as I said, and our Alliance for Academic Internal Medicine has some modules on the website about how to write, how to both provide structure, and then this idea of getting beyond a pleasure to work with, how to write less biased assessments of our learners. And then in the MedEd portal, there's this really nice workshop that you can do on anti-bias and reducing stigmatizing language. And I think John Dalrymple and others are giving a workshop later today on a similar subject. So if you're in the chat, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this too. Okay, so we talked about how we assess, and we're going to do it regularly, and we're going to think about changing the domains. Then we talked about how we write up our assessments, and we're going to be really attentive to language and try to write behavior-based assessments rather than personality-based assessments. And now is the topic of grades. You know, as I said, we used to use the shelf exam for a cutoff for the highest grade. I don't know if I said that, but I think I said that. And I think for a lot of people, so we got rid of grades, and I think a lot of people actually got rid of grades. And so this idea of the shelf exam being an important part of the grade went away. I know that some people are still using grades, and some people are still using shelf exams. And I know at our institution, we're having a lot of conversations over and over again about how to use the shelf exam. I don't know. The shelf exam, I think, is problematic for a lot of reasons, and I think that using it as a cutoff definitely makes for a lot of bias. So what about grading committees? I don't know if people out there have grading committees. You know, grading is a skill. Right, is a skill that requires practice and feedback, and it's a process that's fraught with a ton of potential individual bias. And grading committees in some ways are really great. They relieve individuals of the burden of doing all of the grading, which I used to have to do sometimes, and the possibility of this application and activation, which I mentioned at the beginning. And some of the benefits of grading committees are that there's group decision making. You know, maybe groups make better decisions. There's people can share and process information in a standardized and consistent manner, and the people can have a shared mental model. And of course, I keep saying this, but faculty have to be trained to do it well. So faculty, for example, would need to be trained on how to interpret and synthesize discrepant or vague data, right? Like, what do you do with the outliers, for example? But there are obviously also challenges to grading committees. There's confounding variables that may come into play. There's implicit bias that comes into play, implicit bias towards UIM students, and then implicit bias in the narrative evaluations, which we just talked about, that you'll be reading, right? You get these evaluations, and some of them are just sort of crazy biased. And then there's confirmation bias, and the flip side of groups making better decisions is group harmony or group think. And those are a few of the, I think, risks of grading committees. So this paper from Frank and others and JGIM has some really nice guidelines about how to set up grading committees if you're interested in it. But then, of course, there's the question of whether or not to give grades at all. And COVID gave us a nice chance to examine this in real time, I think. You know, I think the jury is still out on our listserv in academic medicine. In internal medicine, there's a whole conversation now about whether people got rid of grades during COVID, whether they're getting back. Some institutions are going back to grades and some aren't. I just bring it up as something to think about, and maybe we can talk about it later in the group or not. I don't know. Some people have found this topic particularly radioactive, and so I don't know. I'm here to talk about it with you all. And finally, I just want to put out the idea of us returning to the idea of the pillars, right? We talked about patient care and research and medical education being the three pillars. I just want to return to this idea of remembering to treat medical education with the same careful hand and attention that we do everything with, right? That we take pride in doing everything with. I think the best med ed reform comes from a scientific perspective. I think the best med ed reform comes when you have a question and then you study it and then you look at the answer and then you revise it. We have a joke that there's no such thing as a failed pilot at our institution. I think that that's not scientific, and I would love to see across the country, I would love to see us being more thoughtful. At our institution, we have an amazing educational CQI group, the Office of Educational Quality Improvement, and we are often regularly meeting and thinking and studying and imagining and asking the question, what are we doing? How can we do it better? How can we look back at what we did? And does that still work? There's lots of stuff in the CQI world. There are lots of examples from the world of patient safety and patient quality improvement. And I think we can do that. And so some specific things that we can do, and I think the institutions that do it well, including I think ours, is we review clerkship data regularly. We look for equity in the grades. We look at sex differences in grades. We look at UIM status of our students. We're constantly reviewing this. We look at mistreatment reports. We look at the faculty who are doing well and who need some support. We talk to them about it. And then we look at how students feel about the clerkship structure and content, and we review this constantly. We include students in a lot of our committees. So I think there are ways to do this that feel scientific and feel attentive to the details in the same way we would be attentive to the details if this were in the patient care realm. The issue, of course, is that this can't exist in a vacuum, right? This has to exist in an institution where there is institutional level buy-in from the higher ups and support and collaboration. And so I think thinking about committee formation, it can't just be grassroots. It has to be on the level of the leadership of the institution. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I just want to remember the social ecological model and just think for a second about what we talked about. We talked about how bias can be activated and applied, and we thought about that in the interpersonal and individual strata of this model. But I also said that there are structures that we can put in place at an institutional level that will support all of the things that we can do to prevent bias from being applied. So structures put in place, like, I'll give you an example. Right now it's residency selection time. Standardization of residency interviews is a really good example of institutional support for standardization of processes that will mitigate the effects of individual bias. And then we talked about bias in the learning environment, inequities in the learning environment. We talked a little bit about what we can do at the learning environment level. But again, I want to say that none of this can happen, as I said, without institutional support. It's really important for us to remember that. And to that end, I'm just going to share with you a little vignette that I sometimes think about, which is that I was flying overseas with my kids years ago. My daughter was really little, and she said, "Oh, look, 3 stars." She was pointing to Orion's belt. And I said, "Yeah, that's Orion's belt." And she said, "Oh, 3 stars, 3 stars." And I said, "Yes, it's Orion's belt. It's 2 in the morning. I go to sleep." And what I realized was she was seeing 3 individual stars, and I couldn't see 3 individual stars because what I was seeing was 3 stars that were part of a larger constellation whose very existence depended on those 3 stars. Why am I telling you that story? I'm telling you that story because I really think it's important for us to think about this way, that we can try as individuals to make things better. We can try as individuals to make our work, to make our workspace, our clinical learning environment, a place that's less fraught with bias and is less affected by injustice. We can try to be individually pro-equity in our approach to medical education, but it's critically important for us to remember that the institution has to do it too, because the institution is made up of all of us individuals. Without the individuals, the institution doesn't exist. And without the institution, the individuals don't exist. So that's where I'm going to stop, because I think there's a lot for us to talk about. And I keep saying I wish we were in person, because it would be great to mingle and to chat. But I want to just thank you all so much for your attention, and thank you all for inviting me here. And I'll pass the mic to the moderator. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that excellent talk. The chat is blowing up. So I'm going to do my best to try and grab some questions out of the chat. There are a lot. So first question is coming from Dr. Nadine Katz, our president of APGO. So how does your school evaluate or rank students in the MSP without having grades as a metric? And do you think not having grades for program directors to view hurts your students' residency applications? So there's lots of concern from numerous people in the chat about transitioning to sort of no grades or pass fail, and how this might impact students in the residency match.
Well, if we were in person, thank you for that question. If we were in person, I would pass the mic right now to Nikki Johnson and ask her to answer this for me. I mean, you know, this is something that comes up a lot for us, right? We're in medicine, because we have tons of students who always go into internal medicine. And the question really is, are we hurting them or harming them? I just glanced at the chat super quickly and saw that there was the word pedigree there. I think that's absolutely right. There is this worry that suddenly people become their pedigree, right? And so our students, I think, you know, the question we have to ask ourselves is, are our students in the middle affected, the middle of the pack students? And are our students from less well-known institutions affected most by this, right? Is getting rid of grades something, the luxury of the elite, right? Is it something that only privileged institutions can do? I don't know the answer. I'd be really interested to hear what you all think of this. What's going on in your world?
Yeah, I would say from just being able to follow the chat a little bit more while you were speaking, is definitely the concern, is that this could end up, while you're trying to be more equitable in the distribution and sort of how you assess students, then are you sort of pushing the can down the road, and now we're creating inequity, and it's the prestigious schools that are, you know, are going to benefit from this, and the other schools are potentially going to be hurt from it. There are some, let me find another question came from Dr. Royce. Do you think the algorithms or some of the software programs that analyze narratives for bias in language are helpful, or do you find them problematic?
Is that my friend Celeste Royce asking that question? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
It's interesting that you say that. I was going to mention this, but I forgot to mention it, that there are all these algorithms in Google, right? And sometimes I do that actually just to see if the letters I write, because I write a lot of letters, and so I just sometimes take the entirety of my text and I put it in one of these Google things to see how biased I'm being. I think they're interesting. I think they have. I think there is some language that I think it can draw our attention to gendered language. I'm not sure that it can draw our attention any more than our own kind of watchful eye can do it. Maybe it just does it faster. But like in our clerkship, for example, my co-directors and I have really, really, really tried to make sure that we lead with medical knowledge and clinical reasoning skills, and we then go to, or that we're standardized, that if we're going to lead with medical knowledge for men, we're going to lead with medical knowledge for women. We're not, because I'll give you an example. We've noticed that when we read the letters from people, if it talks about how great a communicator a man is, we often scratch our heads and say, where's the medical knowledge part of this? Right? Because it's gender non-normative. And so we're trying to be very, very, very attentive on a sort of personal and clerkship structural level to these sorts of details. But I'll add one more thing to Celeste and everybody else. There is something to be said for textual analysis, which is what some of the work that my colleagues and I have published on is based in, this idea of large scale textual analysis. And I think it would be fascinating to like look at OB/GYN letters and see across the board what the letters are about, like what kinds of themes come up.
Yeah. I think I heard a scholarly project suggestion for a future ASL member. So here's a question coming from Dr. Laura Mercer. It says, do you have any advice or best practices related to using frequent work-based assessment as formative feedback while keeping separate from the summative feedback? Pass-fail grading is one way, wondering if there are other good ways to go about this.
It's interesting that you say that, because if I'm understanding correctly, I think you're asking about in the moment assessments being used as feedback rather than as formal final assessments. I think that there's actually a place for an in the moment assessment to be both. I think final summative assessments have to be based on those repeated informal regular assessments in the moment, and those have to be what the feedback is based on too. I don't know if that makes sense, but it feels to me like it's all of a piece. I will say that sort of embedded in the question that you're asking, or the comment that you're making, is this idea of assessment as a way of giving feedback, which is this concept of assessment for learning rather than just assessment of learning. And I think I hope we are moving towards this idea of assessment for learning. So we assess, give feedback, assess again, give feedback.
Great.
Yes.
A question from Dr. Claire says, what's your opinion regarding holistic review and evaluation, which speaks to your points regarding student domains, grading committees, and language?
Yeah, so holistic review is a few years old now, and I think that mostly in the domain of GME, so in the domain of residencies, doing holistic review of their applicants rather than looking, yeah, exactly, in GME. I think there's something to be said, absolutely, for holistic review. I actually think applications could be blinded in more ways than holistic review does. But I think that's absolutely right. You know, there's this idea of our institutions looking for the best applicant, and I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means. If we think about graduate medical education being an extension of undergraduate medical education, I think we think of it as a portal, right? You're like graduate from medical school and then you become a doctor, and then you're like the best resident or something, you become a doctor. But I think it's just the next day, you know, you're a med student here, and then the next day you're a resident. So this continuum of education is happening. So graduate programs still have to train. And the question I think we should be asking is not, is this the best applicant, but is this somebody whose values as expressed in the work they've done match our values as expressed in our institutional stance towards medical education and medical care? Is this somebody who we want to be part of our team here? Is this somebody we think we can train to be the best possible doctor that he or she can be? So that's, I think, what I would say about holistic review. I hope that was a sort of answer.
That was great. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. This is coming in from Dr. Armstrong, who says that I see this cascade in real life. Students I see in our clerkship who are URIM are often responding to the biases that you spoke of. They diminish their presence, they don't speak up, they're not taking up space when they have the ability to do that. And then there's this snowball effect where they have lower clinical performance assessment scores. And when they're encouraged to kind of, take up the space that they rightfully deserve, they're worried that this then subjects them to biases because they're considered perhaps being aggressive or being too New York or some other negative bias. So how do you both encourage the assessors to be aware of their biases and really uplift our URIM students?
Yeah. So I try to, it's a great question. I would love to hear what other people do too. But you're exactly right. We know there's an amplification cascade. We know that there's imposter syndrome. We know that there's stereotype threat. We know there are all these things. I think what we try to do in our clerkship is we give everybody a pep talk at the beginning and make sure that they know that we're there. I sort of thank the students ahead of time for the work I know that they're going to do. I also tell them that it's going to be hard. And we try to reach out to the students a lot just to make the learning environment better. And in medicine, I think we do okay with that. OB-GYN at our institutions too tends to do well in kind of learning environment stuff. But I think the more important point that you're making is about faculty development, and faculty development around this has to be robust. When everybody, poor John Dalrymple has heard me say this like 500 times, but when everybody is trained to do their job well, there's less effective bias. Bias is less powerful. So when everybody is trained to do their job well, meaning when all faculty are trained to assess all of their students well, they will assess all of their students well. It's when faculty are not trained that bias kind of sneaks in, and that our most at-risk learners are at even higher risk. So that's, I think, what I would say about that our job, I think, is to be more robust in faculty development than maybe we are. And again, a shout out to our OB-GYN group, because I think they're really, really good at this.
Excellent. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut our time short, and there are so many more questions and comments coming up in the chat. So we will save the chat and hopefully be able to post that somewhere in resources so everyone can follow up on those discussions outside of today. And there was one last request to have you share anything you're willing to share, Dr. Osman, either your PowerPoints or your resources, particularly some interest in those assessments that you showed, or at least the
I'll share everything. Please reach out to me. I'm very easy to find, and this has been an absolute delight. Maybe I'll sneak into the meeting next year too.
Definitely. You're always welcome. We are as good live as we are virtual, and probably better live.
Great.
So now's the time to take a little bio break before our next plenary session, which starts at 2:15 with Dr. Erica Marsh. So take a break and see you in a few minutes.